So first up on our list is the remarkably uninteresting task of dealing with users and computers inside of the graphical tools that we have here at Windows Server. As you can see, I'm back here on my computer dc.company.pri, and in a production world, you're probably not going to be performing these tasks on the domain controller itself, but I'm going to punt some of the remote uses of these tools until Jason gets an opportunity to talk about the remote management of Windows Server. So let's assume here that I've got my machine dc.company.pri. There are actually a pair of different tools that you can use for managing users and computers here in the operating system. The first of which is the old tool, what I like to call the ADUC, or Active Directory Users and Computers. The second of which I'll just open up here so we can see it, is the new tool called Active Directory Administrative Center. Now, these two tools perform many of the same functions. The ADAC, the newer tool, provides some additional functions that have to do with things like dynamic access control, some other additional bits that you can add in as well. The biggest difference here is that the ADAC, different from the ADUC, runs on top of Windows PowerShell. And so if you're going about performing many of these tasks, when you go in here to click and create users and do the variety of tasks like creating new ones and viewing their properties, under the covers, what you're actually performing is some PowerShell command to complete the action that you've told this tool to do. Now I'm going to flip back here to the old tool because I'm old school and old habits die hard, so that we can take a look at just the users and computers that are here in this Active Directory domain. Now, this is, as you're probably aware, a domain that is right out of the box. I mean, we just created it. So the things that you see here are going to be the types of users and groups and computers and whatnot that you would assume exist in a freshly created domain. Here on the left, you can see the long list of organizational units and other containers that exist here in our domain company.pri. And over on the right, because we focused here on the list of users, are those users and then the groups that are available right out of the box. For us to create a new user, the process to create a new user, I can't believe we're going through this, is to go new user and then provide that first name and last name, so this is my name, and then a user logon name for the individual. Over here at the right, you can see what we call the UPN suffix for that user logon name. Here in Microsoft Windows, newer versions of Microsoft Windows, we have the ability to log on via either of these two approaches. The pre-Windows 2000 approach, which is what many of us still use today, the domain name / user logon name approach, or the more new school method, which is username @ domain name, company.pri. Now, later on in the 412 content, I'll talk more about how you can go about changing these UPN suffixes. If you have a preferred suffix you'd like your users to use that may be different from what your domain name is, there's a little trickery that you can do in some of the other Active Directory tools to allow you to support that. But for now, right out of the box, the way in which a user is going to log in is going to be here, username @ domain name or domain name / username. For any user that we may enter in, we're going to have to punch in a password that supports whatever our password restrictions are going to be, those rules that we've applied. We'll talk a little more about those password policies in an upcoming course when we're getting into group policy. And then for that user, rather than requiring the user to change the password at the next logon, let's just set the user to not change the password and set the password to never expire. Now, you wouldn't do that in production, but I tend to do that for my user account in these test and lab environments, just so that I'm not forced to change the password, perhaps in the middle of filming one of these different modules. Now, once I've created the user, then there are a large number of different fields that we could potentially enter in that are associated with the user account. So a description of the user, their office, their telephone number, their email, their physical address information, their account information, any options that we may see down here. If the account ends up getting locked for one reason or another, perhaps they've entered in their password incorrectly too many times, well, I can unlock the account by choosing the checkbox here. I can also set an expiry on the account down here at the bottom, which is used most often when I have temporary accounts or perhaps consultants, external users that are coming in, that when I create that account, I want to make sure that that account doesn't inadvertently stick around past the point that that person should no longer be a part of the organization. I can also choose profile information here, so what their user profile would be and what their home folder would be, telephone information, any organizational information, and a whole host of other tools like remote control and a remote desktop services profile, any COM plus partition sets they may be associated with, as well as the session information, the environment information, the dial-in information, and what groups they're a member of. Now, I flipped through every single one of these tasks for a reason, and it's not just to just show you what all the tabs are. But to highlight the notion that it's entirely feasible, Microsoft may want you to know where certain information would need to be entered in when you're creating a new user account. So even though it may seem silly for me to flip through all these tasks, I would at least spend a couple of minutes here with the properties of a user, and again, the properties of a computer. So at least you have a good familiarity for where the different types of information may need to be entered. Let's assume that this user, the Greg Shields user, is one that needs to have lots of privileges here in the domain. I want to essentially create a user myself that will give me all the privileges to accomplish the things that we would need to do for all the courses upcoming. So because of that, I need to give myself a membership in one or more additional groups that would provide those privileges. Now, anytime I create a new user, well, that user is going to be created with the domain users membership. You have to be in domain users in order to support attaching to and working with any of the objects that make up an Active Directory domain. Not in every case, but in almost every case. In order to give additional access, I would need to add that additional access here. And if I wanted to, I could click the Advanced button to take a look at the possible different groups that this user could be added to. If I choose the Find Now button, this will list those groups here. So for this user, I'm interested in adding them in as a domain administrator, which would give me access to doing all the things here in the domain. But I also want to give them access to enterprise admins as well as schema admins, so that I can support all the needs that I may potentially require for making changes at the forest level, that's the case in enterprise admins, and also for making changes to the schema, which would be here under schema admins. Now, in a production environment, it is a best practice for you not to include users in either the enterprise admins or the schema admins group, except in those situations where they actually require the use of those privileges. In higher security environments, it's also a great idea to not include them as a domain admin either, except in those cases where they need to use their domain admin's privileges. So you'll see me include these here because this is a lab environment, but in the real world, you probably aren't going to see too many people that exist in these additional groups, except in those circumstances when they need to use the privileges. Conversely, if you do see users permanently in these groups, you might have an argument there for changing some of the security policies that exist in your organization today. So there's our user, Greg Shields, and this indeed is the excitement of creating and configuring a user here in our Active Directory domain. Let's go about configuring another user here. This will be another user that is not going to have any privileges. We have no trust in this individual to give them any kind of access here in our domain. So let's create this second user and call them the Jason Helmick user. We'll call him Jason at company.pri and then give him a password as well, so that user has the ability to just log on and perform all the basic stuff that they're used to seeing here in Active Directory. There's my Jason Helmick very low privileges user that we'll work with a little later on. Now I show you the creation of the Jason Helmick account because there are a couple other things that we need to know here, which is the copying as well as the deletion of users and also computers here in Active Directory. And all I want to show you here is that when you right click on a user, you can choose to copy that user to create another user account that has most of the same characteristics of the user you're copying. You'll need to go through additional tasks like changing the user logon name and changing the permissions. But this copy object allows you to create what is effectively the same user as Jason with a different user identity. So if I needed to create a Don Jones account with a similar set of no privileges, I could do so by just copying the object here. And then lastly, to delete an account, I can right click and choose the delete item here. Now, even though the delete item is pretty self-explanatory, the one thing I do want to point out is that when you go about providing permissions for your different individuals in IT that may go about creating and removing accounts, just be conscious of how easy it is to go about deleting an account. The deletion of an account can happen with just a couple of inadvertent mouse clicks. As you see here, we have an "Are you sure" prompt for deleting that user, Jason Helmick, but I could very easily accidentally go about removing this user and potentially even multiple users if I wasn't careful. So be conscious of when you're providing those permissions to users to make them aware that the abilities to work with Active Directory users and computers also comes with the abilities to inadvertently delete Active Directory users and computers as well. Now, this is the user side of the equation. We also have over here the computer side of the equation as well. And as you can see here, we already have one computer in our Active Directory domain. That's file 1. Now, you can actually come in here and right-click to create a new computer object here in your domain. However, you don't find yourself doing that all too often. And the reason is that the process to add a computer into the Active Directory domain automatically creates the computer account as part of that process. It is for this reason why you have to have special privileges in order to add a machine into the domain. Well, in certain circumstances, you may find the need to pre-position computer accounts in Active Directory to support one reason or another. Later on in this module, when we start talking about the offline domain join feature, that's one place where actually creating these computer accounts first before you go about adding the machine to the domain is something that has to happen. But again, in most circumstances, most of the time, you rarely find yourself creating new computer accounts using this interface. Now, the only thing I want to show you over in the other interface, in the Active Directory Administrative Center, is the fact that all of the different functions that you see in the ADUC are replicated over here in the ADAC. And one of the main reasons why I didn't show you this first is just really it's pure personal preference. I've used the Active Directory, the ADUC, Active Directory Users and Computers, for far more years than the ADAC. The other reason, too, is that personally, I tend to find that if we click through here and start looking through the various items that exist in our user, or in our domain, like flipping down here to the user's organizational unit, if I locate a user like my Greg Shields user object here and view properties, there's just one long list here of all the possible properties that could be associated with this user account. So instead of having a variety of tabs that you have to flip through in order to enter in all this information, when you're using the ADAC, all of this information is included in one view. Now down here at the bottom, you can see a replication of these additional extensions, the other tabs that are part of this user account. So in some places, I guess you get rid of the tabs, and in other places, you have to maintain those tabs. Just personally, I prefer the old tool just because of the way it visualizes information.